This Tales of Legendia retrospective was brought to you by my lovely patrons on Patreon. For as little as $3 a month, you can get your name shouted out at the start of every Xenosanctum video, as well as access to bonus behind the scenes content. As I said in my last video, one of the best things about doing these retrospectives is trying out the Tales games that I've never played before. While Tales of Rebirth might have been my most anticipated game to try out, Tales of Legendia unfortunately had the honour of being the one I was most cautious to play. With the exception of a few outspoken Tales fans, this game is quite despised by the wider Tales community for its questionable design choices. Are these criticisms warranted though? Let's find out as we look back on 2005's Tales of Legendia. 2005 would mark the 10-year anniversary of the Tales series. From a niche Super Famicom game, the Tales series had grown into a multimedia empire, with 6 main series games, multiple spin-off games, as well as a series of mangas and animes. With the Tales franchise now an iconic brand, Namco decided that a new mainline Tales game every year wasn't good enough, and would create a brand new team to develop even more Tales games. This team, commonly known as Project Melfes, would consist of a handful of Tales developers, alongside developers from other iconic Namco series, most notably Tekken and Soul Calibur. With Tekken and Soul Calibur being critically acclaimed fighting game series, it seemed fitting to have such developers work on the franchise, whose battle system was very fighting game-esque. However, a drawback to this team would be the lack of RPG specialists who could craft a fitting narrative for the battles to occur in. Project Melfes' Tales game would begin development sometime in the early 2000s, with director Yurichiro Sadahiro helming the project while Go Tanaka and Koichi Matsumoto would write the plot. Tanaka and Matsumoto would focus the plot around the concept of the bonds between the main cast of characters, and would give the game the characteristic genre of RPG where bonds spin legends. When it came to naming the game, the team looked to the underlying mythology that drove the plot, and would name the game Tales of Legendia, not realising that such a title sounds absurdly ridiculous in English. Designing the characters for this game would fall to newcomer Kazuto Nakazawa, who seemingly had an obsession with putting round gems on all the characters. These characters would be rendered in full 3D, but the team would soon run into issues with the game's large monster enemies obscuring the characters in battle, and thus would keep the battle system locked to a single line of combat like in classic 2D Tales games. Namco would unveil Tales of Legendia in arguably one of the strangest ways possible. If players pre-ordered Tales of Rebirth, they would receive a bonus disc that detailed a brand new game under the name Project Melfes. Namco would probably unveil the game in early 2005 with its full name and release date of August later that year. Namco would also announce a North American release for early 2006, but no PAL release. Instead, we would get the PSP remake of Tales of Eternia. As I said in my Tales of Destiny retrospective, to date, Tales of Destiny and Tales of Legendia are the only 2 mainline Tales games with no official PAL release. With the Namco Tales Studio riding high on the success of 6 critically acclaimed titles, could this new Tales team possibly live up to the quote-unquote legacy of previous Tales games? The story begins with our protagonist, Senel Coolidge, and his sister Shirley Finnis on the run as they battle stormy seas and monsters. Suddenly a giant landmass comes out of nowhere, throwing the ship to one side, which drifts into a small bay. On the beach, Shirley is found to be unconscious after being hit by seawater, and Senel begins looking for help. A man by the name of Will Renard comes down to the beach to see what is going on. Senel asks where they are, and where he can find some fresh water. Will explains that they are on a giant island-sized ship called the Legacy, and there is a nearby spring up the road. Without a second thought, Senel picks up Shirley and runs off to the spring. Chasing after the two, Will is shocked to find Shirley submerged in the water. Senel explains that everything is okay as freshwater heals Shirley. Suddenly a mysterious man shows up and attempts to kidnap Shirley. Thus Senel gets into a fight with a would-be kidnapper. During the chaos of the fight, a bandit by the name of Moses Sandor kidnaps Shirley for himself and makes off with her. The mysterious man then chases after Moses, followed shortly by Senel, who decides to team up with Will. The two make their way to Werris' Beacon, the largest settlement on the Legacy, to plan out how to rescue Shirley from Moses. After some commotion in which we get a fight followed by a musical number, Senel and Will head off to Moses' lair. On the way, the two run into a young knight by the name of Chloe Vullens, who's also in pursuit of the bandits. The three then make their way to Moses' lair, where they find Shirley locked in a room, to which Moses has the key. Approaching Moses himself, the three battle and defeat him, winning the key off him to unlock Shirley's room. Suddenly Moses' lair finds itself under attack by soldiers dressed in red. While Moses and his men go off to fight the soldiers, Senna and the gang unlock Shirley's room, only to find the mysterious man from the spring there. The man captures Shirley and then flies off with her. With Shirley kidnapped, the three are on the chase again and soon run into a treasure hunter by the name of Norma Bertie, who is also apparently the most hated character in the entire Tales fandom. I have no idea why.
I've made up my mind. I'm gonna let you join my party.
What?
I've been looking for an errand I could get some mileage out of.
After inadvertently helping Norma deal with a monster she had provoked, the four catch up with the mysterious man in some underground ruins. Defeating the man in combat, the group rescues Shirley but soon find themselves trapped underground due to some unnatural earthquakes. Luckily, the five run into some strange otter-like creatures called the Orosaurin, who help the group out of the caves. Now out of trouble, Senna decides that he and Shirley need to part ways with the others, and together the two sneak off to return to their ship. On the way back, the two are ambushed by the soldiers from earlier, led by one Vaclav Bold. Vaclav's generals make quick work of Senel, knocking him out and tossing him off a cliff before making off with Shirley. Wait a minute. The male protagonist's female friend gets kidnapped by a hostile army led by a group of commanders? This is just the plot to the last Tales game! Well, if you guys want to see more of this unoriginal plot, you can easily find the cutscenes on YouTube. Meanwhile, I'll move on to... While Tales of Legendia very much is a Tales game in the way the story progresses and battles are fought, it is still very clear that this game was not made by the same team behind the previous Tales games. For instance, the camera always remains zoomed out, never going in for those close cinematic shots that we saw in Tales of Symphonia. We also have a drastically different user interface than previously seen in Tales games, with a dedicated option to rearrange the party layout. Despite looking different to previous Tales games, Tales of Legendia still presents really well for a late-gen PS2 game. It's hard to say if Legendia is a better looking game than Tales of Symphonia, as the different presentation styles makes an apples to apples comparison difficult. However, I still like the overall look to the game. Tales of Legendia's story almost completely takes place in the giant island-sized ship Legacy. Such a setting makes a lot of sense if you ask me, as I always found it hard to believe that in previous Tales games, parties were able to navigate the entire world on foot in the span of what appears to be a couple of months. I'm sorry, but a trip to Europe and back would take me at least a year on foot. Thus I like the smaller setting for its more believable navigation. I also like the design of the Legacy itself, with plenty of unique outlandish dungeons for our characters to explore, compared to the previous Tales games whose dungeons usually were limited to ruins and forests that all looked relatively the same. However, while the Legacy does have some impressive looking dungeons, they can start to appear samey to one another after a while, and the stale look is made even worse by how long you need to look at them. With the Legacy being a much smaller map than we had previously seen, locations are now much closer together. This would be a plus in my opinion, as I never liked how empty overworlds can be. However, Legendia really wants you to experience that long hike across the overworld as seen in previous Tales games, and thus artificially lengthens travel times by forcing your character to zigzag their way from one location to another, hardly ever letting you get from one place to another in a straight line. This is also true for the dungeons, which can also be dragged out by long zigzagging paths. While there are a few branching paths in dungeons, they are usually covered by chaotic zones. When entering these strange balls, there is a high chance the party will be attacked by a powerful foe. However, as we'll see later on, due to Legendia's pretty easy combat, it's not much of a challenge. Outside of chaotic zones, Legendia's dungeons are pretty bare bones when it comes to puzzles, instead putting them into specialised puzzle rooms. These puzzle rooms are usually found right before the end of a dungeon, and will see the party solve a variety of block puzzles with some occasional targets one must hit with a sorcerer's ring. While the world and dungeon layout is tedious, the Legacy does have a series of warp ducts that can be opened by the party to quickly warp to and from where it is beacon. The ducts end up being the only way to fast travel around, as Tales of Legendia is the first game in the series to drop the obligatory flying craft. While where it is beacon somewhat acts as the main hub, you will still find other settlements across the ship which you can resupply and buy new gear. On the way to these other settlements, you'll be joined by other members including Moses, who switches over from being an antagonist to help you defeat Vaclav. You also meet the shifty figure Jay, who joins the party to protect the Orosaurin from Vaclav's forces. Finishing off the party we have Groon, a mysterious woman who you find in the depths of a dungeon with no memory of how she got there. This leaves Legendia's cast size at 8 members, making it one of the larger Tales cast sizes. One thing with this cast you'll quickly see when you start playing this game is how much they do not get along, with the members frequently throwing insults as well as the occasional head bop. The result of this can be some comedy gold. While the Tales series always had comedic elements going right back to Fantasia, Legendia really pushes the comedy to a whole other level. This is exemplified in the game's take on the Wonder Chef, Mimi Baker, aka the Wonder Baker, who is always a joy when you find her as she usually keeps ending up becoming the butt of some joke. While some might despise this tongue-in-cheek form of storytelling, especially with the fanbase's continuing desire for darker Tales games in recent years, I still really enjoy Tales of Legendia's story. This could be due to me recently playing 2 games covering racism and slavery, and really wanting something a little less intense after that. While Tales of Legendia's story is quite a joy to watch, its skits unfortunately are not. On the bright side, most of the skits are now fully voiced. However, this was likely pretty easy to do seeing as there's so few of them. While I felt like previous Tales games went overboard with the number of skits, Legendia unfortunately goes too far in the opposite direction, with way too few skits. Not only are these skits few in number, they are for the most part not very funny or interesting. Also, the close-up anime models of the characters are also used for multiple cutscenes throughout the story, resulting in the skits looking like additional cutscenes instead of unique special character bonding moments. Once the player finishes the main plot, they'll be given access to a secondary plot focusing around the main cast of characters' backstories. Unfortunately, due to likely budget constraints, the character quests lack any voice acting at all, and can somewhat feel like they're here to draw out the game, and due to time constraints, I unfortunately didn't get very far into these quests before I had to move on to other games. Despite some issues with the game's presentations, Legendia is a pretty solid Tales game outside of battle, however in battle was a whole other story. For the battle system, we now have the Crossover Linear Motion Battle System, or XLMBS. As I said earlier, despite the game using 3D character models like Symphonia, battles completely take place along 2D planes like in classic Tales games. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of this. As I said in my Tales of Rebirth retrospective, what I like about that game's battle system was the sharp controls of 2D character sprites, along with the freedom of the 3D movement, and in Legendia we get neither of these. Legendia is also the first mainline Tales game not to feature any multiplayer options since Fantasia. This was likely due to the team not knowing how to implement such a feature. Legendia tries to account for these shortcomings by being one of the fastest battle systems in the series. I shouldn't be surprised that the makers of Tekken would construct such a high-speed battle system, but damn do Senel's fists fly in combat. Legendia's combat is so fast that I sometimes have trouble getting my inputs out fast enough, leading to me frequently screwing up my combos in battle. As for combos, Legendia copies the art hierarchy from Symphonia, in which you can combo off 3 regular attacks into a base art, followed by an arcane art. However, there is no tier 3 specials. While the combos aren't as long as in Symphonia, the battle speed more than makes up for it, as I find it quite easy to spam my regular attacks into enemies with little opportunity for them to respond, more so than in previous spam heavy Tales games. The result of this, in my opinion, is one of the easiest combat systems in the series. I usually play my Tales games on normal difficulty, as I believe this gives me the intended difficulty the developers wanted, but here in Tales of Legendia it felt more on par with the easy difficulties of previous Tales games, with only a few fights giving me more than a slight challenge. In fact, I even had several fights in which I attempted to run away, only to win the fight before the runtime ran out, although this was partly due to how long the runtime it takes to count down. In general, Legendia takes a lot of its combat layout from Symphonia, lacking in at the front stepping of the Team Destiny games while still allowing for backstepping and magic guarding. However, the game does bring back the slowly regenerating TP gauge from Destiny 2, as well as displaying enemy health without the need for a magical lens. In fact, Legendia is the first game in the series to display the enemy health bar above the enemy you are targeting. This wouldn't be repeated in any other Tales game until Tales of Innocence in 2007. Skills in this game are now called Eras and come in 2 forms, Iron for physical fighters and Crystal for casters, with the cast being evenly split between the 2 forms. For Iron Eras users, we first have our main protagonist, Senel, who completely breaks Tales conventions by using his fists instead of a sword. I guess the Tekken developers won out against the Soul Calibur ones. With his fists, Senel was able to rapidly pummel the enemy at a quick pace, making him extremely easy to use. He is also able to learn a handful of grab and throw attacks. During battle, if the party is able to down an enemy, Senel can then perform one of his grab and throw attacks as long as the enemy falls under the specified weight class. While grabs can be a bit clunky to use, I had a lot of fun with them and really think that such attacks should be in more Tales games. As with the other Iron Aris users, we have Chloe filling in for the classic sword fighter with the usual sword attacks we've all come to be familiar with. Moses sort of fills in for the bowcaster but uses his throwing spear instead. And Jay is sort of the same but instead uses throwing knives as well as a handful of powerful Aris attacks. Speaking of Aris attacks, Iron Aris users can also put together multiple Aris attacks to create powerful compound Arists, which can deal a ton of damage at the cost of a lot of TP. On the other side of the cast, the Crystal Aris users sort of all play the same, with the only major difference being which spells they can unlock. Unlike Iron Aris users, who unlock their Aris attacks with levels, Crystal Aris will need to find specific Aris stones dropped by certain monsters to unlock their new spells. This can mean you can end up missing some critical spells in game simply by not finding enough of a specific Aris stone. However, this wasn't too much of a problem as the game is pretty generous in its item drops. As you may have noticed, Tales of Legendia doesn't really bring anything new to the Tales Battles formula. Unlike the previous games with the SP gauge, 3D battles and Force gauge, Legendia's combat is very much a repeat of what we've already seen in past 2D Tales games like Destiny 2 and Destiny 2. If the battle system was one feature to differentiate it from other games in the series, it would have to be the Climax gauge. The Climax gauge appears as a bar on the bottom of the screen and slowly fills up as you fight the enemy. When it is full, the player can hit L1 to temporarily freeze time and get as many hits to the enemy as they can before the gauge runs out. If the player then hits L1 again before the gauge runs out completely, the party will perform a climax combo, which is sort of this game's version of a Mystic Art. While the battle system doesn't stand out too much, the music is a whole other story. Playing Tales of Legendia, one will immediately notice that the soundtrack sounds very different to those of previous Tales games. That's because Tales of Legendia is the first game in the Tales series not to be composed by the usual duo of Motoi Sakuruba and Shinji Tamura. Instead, we have Go Shina, making his first major breakout into video game composing. Shina had joined Namco back in 1997 as an aspiring musician and would help in the composition to multiple Namco game scores over the next few years before finally getting the honour to compose the music for Project Melfes' Tales game. Shina would initially try to score Legendia in the same vein as previous Tales games, but soon found it easier to follow his own style of music. The result of this would be a soundtrack full of intense string and wind riffs as seen in the main battle theme Battle Artists, as well as rock guitar solos as seen in the love theme Spinning Thoughts, Round Hands. Unlike Sakuruba, whose previous Tales soundtrack relied heavily on MIDI instruments, Shina would choose to fully orchestrate his soundtrack, and the end result is amazing. While I love Sakuruba's battle themes, his tracks out of battle, while thematically solid, are often underwhelming and not very memorable. As a result, I found Shina's music a refreshing change of pace with his unique town and dungeon themes making use of a full orchestra and choir. While not my favourite Tales soundtrack of all time, we come into that soon, Legendia's music was extremely memorable and one I really enjoyed listening to. And it seems I wasn't the only one, as Legendia would end up propelling Shina into major composition roles inside and outside of Namco, eventually composing the soundtrack for the entire God Eater series. Tales of Legendia's opening, Tao, would be performed by the band Doers Infinity, who would also perform the ending song My Tales. In fact, Legendia would feature multiple vocal pieces throughout its score. As for the opening song itself, Tao has gone on to be another one of my favourite tracks to listen to out of the current opening songs, as I am a sucker for those piano runs. Despite all the new faces in this game, it's nice to see Production IG back to do yet another Tales opening cinematic. Legendia's opening is very much a return to form after Rebirth's weird opening, and I put it up there with Symphonia as one of my favourite opening cinematics in the entire series. If Tales of Rebirth was a 2D Tales game trying desperately to be a 3D game, then Legendia feels like a 3D Tales game trying desperately to be a 2D Tales game with how it presents itself. However, that's not to say it's a bad game. A lot of Tales fans like to write off Tales of Legendia as a random experiment from a publisher getting a little too ahead of itself with making new Tales games. However, after playing this game, I really come to enjoy what this game had to offer. From a presentation standpoint, the world of the Legacy is beautiful, and Go Shina's music is great. While the long drawn out overworld and dungeons can be a little tedious, they never drove me to put the game down, as they don't overstay their welcome too much. As for the battle system, while it's a little bare bones, it's still a Tales battle system that I can always find enjoyment in playing. Looking at you again, Arise. In fact, I will go further with my opinions of this game and say that I personally believe Tales of Legendia was instrumental in shaping the future Tales games that came after it. For starters, Tales of Legendia was the first game in the series to bring forward the series' iconic box art, you know, the one with the main cast of characters standing in front of the white background. Legendia was also the first game in the series to really push the comedy sides of the series. While previous Tales games had their funny moments, Legendia really pushes it to the next level, really playing into those anime tropes that the series had been built off. And I think you'll see the more comedic side of the characters really being brought out in the main cast of the Tales games post Legendia. To sum up, while Tales of Legendia is by most accounts the weakest of the 6th generation Tales games, I by no means think that it is a bad game and would happily play this game over the previous generation Tales games. If you haven't already, I really recommend giving Legendia a try, especially if you're a more casual fan of the series, as the lighter story and simpler battle system might end up being a more enjoyable experience. Now, I'm going to admit something. While I really enjoyed playing Tales of Legendia, a part of me really wanted to put this game down, as I really wanted to get into the next mainline Tales game, as it's one of my favourites. So come back next time as I look at 2005's Tales of the Abyss for the PlayStation 2.